Chapter 1. 3 months before he inherited the harbor shack, Ethan Walker was standing in the office of Bayline Shipyards holding a cardboard box that contained everything he had left from 8 years of work. A framed photograph of his father, a coffee mug with a cracked handle, 2 work gloves that no longer matched. Outside the office window, welders continued working on a steel fishing vessel as if nothing had happened. For everyone else, it was a normal Tuesday. For Ethan, it felt like the day his life quietly collapsed. "We're cutting 30 positions, his supervisor, Carl Benton, had said without looking him in the eye. "It's not personal." Ethan remembered staring at the man for several seconds. Carl had hired him 8 years earlier. They had shared hundreds of lunches together. Yet now Carl seemed more interested in the paperwork on his desk than the man losing his livelihood. "Not personal?" Ethan finally asked. Carl sighed. "You know how things are." No, Ethan thought. He didn't know how things were. 1 week earlier, management had promised everyone their jobs were safe. 3 days later, half the workforce was gone. As he walked through the shipyard carrying the box, nobody knew what to say. Some nodded, others looked away. One younger worker named Tyler hurried over and handed Ethan a folded $20 bill. "Just take it," Tyler said quietly. Ethan tried to refuse. Tyler pushed it into his hand. "You bought me lunch for 2 months when my wife was sick." Ethan looked at the bill and felt something tighten in his throat. That $20 would later buy gas he desperately needed. At the time, neither man knew it. The weeks that followed moved quickly and slowly at the same time. Applications disappeared into online portals. Interviews led nowhere. Savings vanished. Bills arrived with frightening consistency. Then came the arguments with Sarah. At first, they were small arguments. Why hadn't he found work? Why was he spending money fixing an old truck? Why wasn't he trying harder? Eventually, the arguments stopped being about money at all. One evening, Sarah sat across from him at the kitchen table without touching her dinner. "I can't keep doing this," she said. Ethan already knew what was coming. The silence afterward felt worse than the words themselves. 2 weeks later, she moved out. The house belonged to her parents. Ethan packed his clothes and left. That was how a 34-year-old man ended up sleeping in the cab of a faded blue pickup truck beside a public boat ramp. Most nights he parked near the water because it was quieter. Fishermen launched before sunrise. Seagulls screamed overhead. The smell of salt water reminded him of childhood summers. Somehow that made everything slightly easier. One morning he woke to someone tapping on his window. An elderly fisherman stood outside holding a styrofoam cup. Ethan rolled down the glass. "You alive in there?" the old man asked. "Barely." The fisherman handed him the coffee. "Then drink this." The last time Ethan Walker saw his uncle alive was almost 7 years earlier. He remembered it because the meeting had lasted less than 10 minutes and ended with an argument neither of them bothered to finish. Back then, Ethan was 27, working overtime at Bayline Shipyards, convinced he had his future under control. His uncle Thomas had driven into town in an old rust-covered pickup and invited him to spend a weekend at the harbor shack. Ethan declined. Thomas invited him again. Ethan declined again. The old man finally shook his head and laughed. "One day you'll learn that jobs disappear faster than the tide." Ethan had rolled his eyes at the time. It sounded like something an old fisherman would say. Now, 7 years later, those words came back to him while he sat alone inside his truck, counting the last $68 in his wallet. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. The parking lot outside a public boat ramp was nearly empty except for 2 fishing trailers and a faded red van with a broken headlight. Ethan folded the bills and slid them back into his pocket. $68. That was everything. 3 months earlier, he had a steady paycheck. 2 months earlier, he still had a marriage. Now he had neither. He glanced at his phone. No missed calls, no job offers, No messages from Sarah. The battery sat at 11%. He plugged it into the truck charger and watched the screen light up with an unknown number. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Most unknown numbers lately belonged to debt collectors. The phone rang again. He answered. "Ethan Walker," a woman's voice asked. "Speaking." "My name is Linda Perez. I'm calling from Carter and Finch Legal Services." Ethan closed his eyes. Lawyer. That couldn't be good. "Mr. Walker, I'm sorry to inform you that your uncle, Thomas Walker, passed away 3 days ago." The words landed strangely. Not because he was shocked. Thomas had been 72 and living alone for years. But hearing it said aloud made it real. Ethan stared through the rain-streaked windshield toward the dark water beyond the ramp. "How?" he asked quietly. "Heart failure. Peaceful, according to the medical report." Ethan nodded even though she couldn't see him. The lawyer continued speaking about paperwork, probate, signatures, and appointments. Most of it blurred together until she mentioned one sentence that pulled him back. "You are listed as the sole beneficiary." Ethan frowned. "There has to be a mistake." "No mistake. My uncle barely spoke to me. Even so, you are the only heir named in the will." Ethan almost laughed. The idea that Thomas Walker had left behind anything worth inheriting seemed ridiculous. The old man had spent most of his life fishing, repairing docks, and avoiding people. What exactly did he leave me? There was a brief pause. Papers shuffled on the other end of the line. Then the lawyer answered. "An abandoned harbor property." Ethan waited. "That's it. A harbor shack, according to county records." Ethan leaned back in his seat. For the first time in weeks, he actually smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind that appeared when life found a new way to surprise you. An abandoned shack. Of course, if anyone could leave behind something worthless, it would be Uncle Thomas. After ending the call, Ethan drove to a small diner near the marina because it was warm and he needed coffee. The waitress, a woman named Grace who had seen him several times during the past month, poured a refill before he even sat down. "Any good news today?" she asked. Ethan stirred cream into the cup. "Depends how you define good." "Try me." "My uncle died." Grace stopped smiling immediately. "I'm sorry." Ethan shrugged. "It's okay. We weren't close." "Still." He nodded. "Apparently he left me a shack." Grace blinked. "A shack?" "At some harbor. Maybe it's valuable." Ethan laughed. "If it was valuable, Uncle Thomas would have sold it 20 years ago." A man sitting 2 stools down overheard the conversation. His beard was white, and his baseball cap advertised a fishing charter business that probably no longer existed. "Thomas Walker?" he asked. Ethan turned. "You knew him." "Everybody knew him." The old man snorted. "Meanest fisherman on the coast." Grace pointed a spoon at him. "Don't listen to Frank. He says that about everyone." Frank ignored her. "That shack still standing?" Ethan shrugged. "Apparently." Frank laughed. "Barely." The word lingered in Ethan's mind long after the conversation moved on. Barely. That seemed to describe everything in his life. His truck was barely running. His savings were barely enough. His future was barely visible. And now, somewhere along the coastline, an old harbor shack was apparently still standing. Barely. What Ethan didn't know yet was that within a week, he would be sleeping inside that shack. He didn't know that storms, Hunger and loneliness waited for him there, and he certainly didn't know that hidden somewhere inside the property was a locked harbor locker that nobody had opened for decades. But the first thread of that mystery had already begun to pull tight around his life. He just didn't recognize it yet. 3 days later, Ethan drove north along the coastline with less than half a tank of gas and a paper folder containing his uncle's will sitting on the passenger seat. The harbor town of Greyport appeared around a bend in the road shortly before noon. It was smaller than he remembered. Most of the paint on the waterfront buildings had peeled away years ago. Several storefronts stood empty. Fishing boats rocked gently in the marina, while seagulls circled overhead, screaming at one another. Ethan parked beside a bait shop and stepped out to stretch his legs. Across the street, 3 older men sat on a bench facing the water. They looked like they had been sitting there every day for the last 20 years. One of them noticed Ethan carrying the folder. "You're lost," the man called out. Ethan walked over. "I'm looking for Harbor Point Road." The oldest of the 3 narrowed his eyes. "What business you got down there?" "I inherited a property." The second man laughed before Ethan even finished speaking. "Not Thomas Walker's place." Ethan stopped. "Actually, yes." The 3 men exchanged looks. One shook his head. Another muttered something under his breath. The oldest man finally sighed. "Son, you should have inherited something useful instead." Ethan smiled politely. "That's what everyone keeps telling me." The old fisherman pointed toward the far end of the harbor. "Road follows the shoreline. Can't miss it. Broken dock, leaning shack. Looks like a strong breeze could finish the job." As Ethan walked back to his truck, he heard one of them say, "Wonder how long he'll last." The others chuckled. 20 minutes later, he understood exactly why. The shack sat alone beyond the working harbor where the pavement gave way to gravel and weeds. Years of storms had battered the structure. The roof sagged noticeably on one side. Several boards hung loose along the exterior walls. Half the dock stretched into the water, while the other half appeared to have collapsed years earlier. The property looked less like an inheritance and more like something forgotten by time itself. Ethan killed the engine and sat quietly for a moment. This was it. The last thing his uncle had owned. He grabbed the keys the lawyer had mailed him and walked toward the front door. The lock resisted before finally turning with a loud metallic snap. The door opened inward, accompanied by a groan from the hinges. Dust floated through beams of sunlight cutting across the room. The smell hit him first. Salt water, old wood, rust, something faintly fishy lingering from decades of harbor life. The main room was surprisingly small. A table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves filled with jars, tools, and weathered books. A faded yellow raincoat still hung near the door. Ethan stared at it longer than expected. For a strange moment, he could almost imagine his uncle stepping back inside wearing it. Then reality returned. The shack was empty. Quiet, dead. He spent the next hour exploring. The bedroom contained little more than a narrow bed and an old dresser. The kitchen sink no longer worked. The power was disconnected. Several floorboards creaked alarmingly beneath his weight. When he opened the refrigerator, he immediately regretted it and slammed it shut again. Around mid-afternoon, he stepped outside and walked along what remained of the dock. Waves slapped gently against weathered pilings below. He noticed fresh gull feathers trapped between the boards. A crab crawled out from beneath a loose plank and disappeared into the water. The place felt isolated in a way he hadn't experienced before. The nearest occupied building sat almost half a mile away. For the first time, He wondered whether staying here was a mistake. His stomach interrupted the thought. He hadn't eaten since morning. While driving back toward town, he found a small grocery store and spent nearly $15 on canned soup, bread, bottled water, and peanut butter. The cashier was a young woman named Megan, whose name tag hung crookedly from her shirt. "You passing through?" she asked while scanning the items. "Maybe." Ethan hesitated. "I inherited Thomas Walker's shack." Megan stopped scanning. "Seriously?" "That's the reaction everyone gives." She laughed. "Sorry, it's just... nobody ever went near that place." "Why?" Megan shrugged. "Your uncle mostly kept to himself." "Was he mean?" "Not really." She thought for a moment. "Just private." Before leaving, Ethan bought a cheap flashlight from a display near the register. It would become one of the smartest purchases he made all month. By sunset, he was back at the shack. The inside grew dark much faster than expected. Without electricity, every corner became shadow. Ethan heated canned soup on the old stove using a portable camping burner from his truck. While eating at the table, he noticed something carved into the wood beneath layers of scratches. He rubbed away dust and discovered a date, June 14th, 1988. Underneath the date were 3 letters, T.W.S. His uncle's initials. Ethan traced them with his finger. It was the first personal thing he had found all day. Outside, wind rattled the loose boards. The shack creaked occasionally as temperatures dropped. Around 10 o'clock, he decided to sleep there rather than waste gas driving elsewhere. The mattress wasn't comfortable, but it was better than the truck. Sometime after midnight, a loud metallic sound jerked him awake. Clang! Ethan sat upright instantly. The noise had come from somewhere outside. Another clang echoed through the darkness. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch. Moonlight reflected across the harbor. Waves rolled against the pilings below. For several seconds, he saw nothing. Then the beam landed on a separate storage building attached to the rear of the property. One of its metal doors was moving slightly in the wind. Clang! Ethan exhaled. Just the wind. Yet as he turned back toward the shack, the flashlight briefly illuminated something unusual through a cracked window of the storage room. Along the far wall sat a row of old harbor lockers. Most were rusted nearly beyond recognition. Most stood partially open. But even from a distance, one looked different. The last locker remained completely shut. Ethan did not open the storage building that night. Part of him wanted to, but another part reminded him that he was standing alone on a rotting dock after midnight with a flashlight that was already flickering. Whatever was inside could wait until morning. He went back to bed, though sleep came in short fragments. The wind kept rattling the walls, and every creak of the shack sounded like footsteps moving outside. When dawn finally arrived, he was already awake. Gray light filtered through the dusty window as gulls screamed overhead. Ethan pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The harbor looked completely different in daylight, less mysterious, more tired. Rust covered almost every exposed piece of metal. Seaweed hung from broken pilings. The water carried floating scraps of driftwood toward the open bay. He spent several minutes simply standing there drinking instant coffee heated over the camping burner. For the first time in months, he had nowhere he needed to be. No interview, no bills to pay that morning, no phone calls to answer. The realization felt strangely uncomfortable. Around 8 o'clock, he walked to the storage building. The metal door groaned loudly as he pulled it open. Dust swirled in the sunlight. Inside, old fishing equipment filled most of the room. Nets, crab traps, buoys, coils of rope. Everything smelled of salt and rust. Along the far wall stood the row of harbor lockers he had spotted during the night. There were 12 of them. Most doors hung partially open. Ethan checked the first one. Empty. The second contained broken hooks and rusted pliers. The third held nothing but old newspapers that disintegrated when he touched them. He moved methodically down the row. Locker 4. Empty. Locker 5. Empty. Locker 6 contained a cracked lantern. By the time he reached the final locker, he had stopped expecting anything interesting. Yet the last door refused to move. A thick padlock secured it shut. Unlike everything around it, the lock appeared newer. Not new exactly, but newer than the others. Ethan crouched to inspect it. The metal carried scratches around the keyhole, as if someone had tried opening it multiple times. He tugged once. Nothing. He shook it. Still nothing. Finally, he stood back. "Fine," he muttered. "Stay locked." The mystery bothered him more than he cared to admit, but there were more immediate problems. By noon, he discovered the roof leaked in at least 4 places. The first drip landed on his shoulder while he sorted through supplies inside the shack. The second fell directly onto the kitchen table. By the third leak, he grabbed a bucket and climbed onto the roof. Several shingles had completely disappeared. Others shifted beneath his boots. For nearly 3 hours, he worked under the sun, securing loose sections with nails scavenged from the storage building. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep water out for now. While climbing down, he noticed an elderly man approaching from the shoreline, carrying a tackle box. The man moved slowly but steadily, using a walking stick carved from driftwood. Ethan recognized him immediately. It was one of the fishermen from the bench in town. "Didn't think you'd still be here," the old man called. Ethan laughed. "That seems to be the town's favorite prediction." The fisherman smiled slightly. "Name's Walter Reed." "Ethan." Walter nodded toward the shack. "Your uncle would have hated seeing someone on that roof." "Why?" "Said roofs teach people humility. Sooner or later, they always leak again." Ethan found himself smiling. It sounded exactly like something Uncle Thomas might say. Walter set down his tackle box and spent several minutes studying the property. "You know, he built most of this himself." "Really?" "Piece by piece." Walter pointed toward the dock. "That section too." Ethan looked surprised. "Doesn't seem possible." He was stubborn enough to make most things possible. The old fisherman hesitated. Town never understood him much. "Why?" Walter scratched his beard. "That's a longer story." Before Ethan could ask more, the old man changed the subject. "You fishing yet?" "Not really." Walter opened the tackle box and handed him a small collection of hooks and lures. "Then start. Harbor's full of striped bass this time of year." Ethan tried refusing, but Walter insisted. "Think of it as rent for standing on your dock." After the old fisherman left, Ethan spent the afternoon cleaning more of the property. Behind stacks of old crates, he discovered dozens of notebooks arranged neatly on a shelf. At first, he assumed they were financial records. They weren't. Every notebook contained dates, weather conditions, wind direction, tide levels, and handwritten observations. Thousands of entries, decades worth. Ethan opened one at random. April 12th. Tide lower than expected. Baitfish moving south. Storm likely within 48 hours. Another notebook contained similar entries, and another, and another. The sheer amount of detail was astonishing. His uncle had recorded the harbor almost every day for years. Why Ethan couldn't understand it. Yet as evening approached, he found himself sitting at the table reading page after page. Some entries were only a sentence long, others filled entire pages. Occasionally a name appeared: Walter, Frank, Megan's father, people from town, tiny pieces of harbor life preserved in ink. Then he noticed something unusual. Several entries ended with the same symbol, a small circle drawn beside certain dates. Not all of them, only a few scattered across different years. Ethan flipped through another notebook. The symbol appeared again and again. Whatever it meant, his uncle had marked it intentionally. Before he could study further, something fell from between two pages and landed on the floor. It was an old photograph. Ethan picked it up. The picture showed his uncle standing beside three men on a dock sometime decades earlier. All four were smiling. One of them held a fish nearly as large as a child. Written across the back were 6 words in faded blue ink: "Never forget what happened here." Ethan stared at the sentence for a long time. Then he turned the photograph over again. What happened here? No explanation followed. No names, no date. Just those 6 words. Outside, the harbor slowly disappeared into darkness. Inside the shack, Ethan suddenly felt much less certain that his uncle had spent his life recording tides for no reason. The weather changed 2 days later. Ethan noticed it before sunrise while standing outside with a cup of instant coffee. The harbor felt different. The air was heavier. The water had lost its usual rhythm. Even the gulls seemed restless, circling lower than normal and crying more aggressively than usual. He remembered something Walter had said during their conversation: "Pay attention to birds if you want to know what the sea is thinking." At the time, Ethan had assumed the old fisherman was simply being poetic. Now he wasn't so sure. After breakfast, he opened one of his uncle's notebooks and began reading the entries from the same week several years earlier. About halfway down the page, he found a note written in thick black ink. Gulls staying low. Wind turning east. Storm within 36 hours. Ethan glanced outside through the window. The wind was already beginning to shift. For a moment, he sat perfectly still. Then he looked at the leaking roof, the damaged dock, and the loose boards rattling against the shack. A storm was the last thing he needed. By mid-morning, he drove into Grayport for supplies. His remaining money was becoming dangerously low, but ignoring the approaching weather would be worse. At the hardware store, he purchased a small box of nails, a tarp, and a roll of weatherproof tape. The total left him with barely $40. As he loaded everything into the truck, a voice called from behind him. "Trying to save that old shack?" Ethan turned and found Walter climbing out of a weathered pickup. The old fisherman looked toward the darkening clouds gathering offshore. "You're going to need more than tape." Ethan laughed. "That's encouraging." Walter motioned toward his trunk. "Come with me." 20 minutes later, they were standing behind Walter's garage. Piles of scrap lumber leaned against a fence. Rusted tools covered workbenches. It looked like a place where nothing had been thrown away in 30 years. Walter picked through the piles and selected several boards. "Take these." "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." Ethan hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" Walter kept sorting through lumber. "Your uncle helped people when they needed it. Nobody talks about him that way." The old man paused. "That's because most people only remember what they want to remember." Before Ethan could ask what that meant, Walter changed the subject again. Ethan was beginning to notice a pattern. Every time conversation approached Thomas Walker, people suddenly became careful, as if everyone knew part of a story, but nobody wanted to tell the whole thing. By late afternoon, Ethan had secured the tarp over the weakest section of the roof. He reinforced loose wall panels and nailed boards across a broken window facing the harbor. Sweat soaked through his shirt. His hands ached. Yet for the first time since arriving, the shack actually felt slightly more secure. The sky turned gray shortly before sunset, then darker. The horizon vanished beneath thick clouds rolling in from the ocean. Ethan checked another notebook while eating a peanut butter sandwich for dinner. One entry caught his attention immediately. Never ignore the first storm after a calm week. That's when people get comfortable. He smiled despite himself. The note sounded less like a weather observation and more like life advice. Around 9 o'clock, the wind arrived. The first gust slammed against the walls hard enough to rattle dishes inside the cabinets. 10 minutes later, another gust hit even harder. The shack groaned. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch. Waves crashed against the remaining dock pilings below. Spray reached farther inland than he had seen before. Somewhere out in the darkness, a buoy bell clanged repeatedly. The sound echoed through the harbor like a warning. Then the rain began. At first, it came steadily. After midnight, it became violent. Water hammered the roof. Wind screamed around the corners of the shack. Several times, Ethan woke thinking the entire structure was about to slide into the harbor. At one point, a loud crack echoed outside. He rushed to the window and aimed the flashlight toward the dock. One of the old railing sections had broken loose and disappeared into the water. He considered going outside, but quickly abandoned the idea. Nobody was fixing anything in that weather. Near 2 in the morning, another sound reached him, different from the storm. A metallic bang. Then another. Ethan grabbed the flashlight. The noise came from behind the shack. Bang, bang, bang! For several seconds, he debated whether to investigate. Curiosity finally won. Pulling on his rain jacket, he stepped into the storm. Rain instantly soaked his face. The wind nearly knocked him sideways. Flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He fought his way toward the storage building. The metal door was slamming repeatedly against the frame. One hinge had partially pulled loose. Ethan pushed the door shut and secured it with a length of rope. As he turned to leave, the flashlight beam swept across the row of lockers. Something immediately looked wrong. He stepped closer. Locker number 11 stood partially open. He was certain it had been closed before. Slowly, he pulled the door wider. Inside sat nothing except rust and dust. Yet on the floor beneath the locker, he noticed a thin gap between 2 wooden planks. Rainwater dripped through it. Curious. Ethan crouched and aimed the flashlight downward. Beneath the floorboards, he briefly saw what looked like empty space. Not soil, not concrete. A hollow area. Before he could investigate further, another powerful gust shook the building. The entire structure creaked loudly. Ethan backed away. This was not the time. But as he hurried back toward the shack through wind and rain, one thought followed him. There was something underneath that storage room. And judging by the way his uncle had preserved that final locked locker, whatever lay below might not be there by accident. The storm moved out shortly after sunrise, leaving behind a harbor that looked as though it had fought a battle during the night. Pieces of driftwood littered the shoreline. Seaweed hung from broken sections of dock. Several crab traps had washed against the rocks below the shack. Ethan stepped outside carrying a bucket and spent a few minutes simply surveying the damage. It could have been worse. The tarp remained attached. The roof was still holding. Most importantly, the shack itself was still standing. He found himself oddly proud of that fact. 3 weeks earlier, he had been sleeping in his truck. Now he was worrying about the survival of a building most people considered worthless. After a quick breakfast of toast and canned beans, he headed directly for the storage room. The discovery beneath locker 11 had occupied his thoughts all night. The floorboards still glistened from rainwater when he entered. He crouched beside the gap and pushed the flashlight beam downward again. This time, the view was clearer. There was definitely an empty space below, several feet deep, maybe more. He grabbed a pry bar from a workbench and carefully worked one of the loose boards free. The wood came up with a loud crack. Dust rose into the air. Ethan leaned forward and looked through the opening. Beneath the storage room was a narrow cavity running toward the harbor. Not a full basement, more like an old maintenance tunnel. He could see stone walls, wooden supports, and something painted on one of the beams. A symbol. 3 vertical lines crossed by a single horizontal mark. The same strange symbol he had noticed in several of his uncle's notebooks. Ethan stared at it for several seconds. The coincidence felt too deliberate. Before he could investigate further, the sound of an engine approached outside. He replaced the board and stepped out to find a small utility truck pulling into the property. The driver was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and a clipboard tucked under one arm. She climbed out and immediately studying the shack. "You must be Thomas's nephew," she said. "Depends who's asking." The woman laughed. "Diane Mercer, Harbor Authority." Ethan shook her hand. "Am I in trouble?" "Not yet." She pointed toward the damaged dock. "That depends on whether that thing collapses into a navigation channel." For the next 20 minutes, they walked the property together. Diane inspected pilings and made notes on her clipboard. Unlike most people in town, she didn't seem amused by Ethan's decision to stay there. Instead, she appeared genuinely curious. Eventually, they reached the storage building. Diane paused. "Haven't seen this place open in years." "You knew my uncle?" Everyone knew Thomas. Her expression changed slightly, or thought they did. Ethan had heard similar answers enough times to recognize them immediately. "What does that mean?" Diane hesitated. "Your uncle had a reputation." "For what?" She looked out toward the water. "Depends who you ask." Then, just like Walter, she changed the subject. Ethan was beginning to suspect the entire town was part of some unspoken agreement. Everyone knew something. Nobody wanted to explain it. Before leaving, Diane handed him a folded paper. "Weather advisory." Ethan unfolded it. Another storm system was predicted later that week. Smaller than the last one, but still significant. "Looks like I picked the perfect month to move in," he said. Diane smiled. "Welcome to Grayport." After she left, Ethan spent the afternoon gathering driftwood and repairing sections of fence blown apart during the storm. While working, he noticed a boy standing near the edge of the property watching him. The kid couldn't have been older than 12. He wore oversized boots and carried a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was. The moment Ethan looked his way, the boy pretended to examine the water. "You planning to fish or spy on me?" Ethan called. The boy grinned. "Maybe both." Ethan laughed. "What's your name?" "Lucas." "You live nearby?" The boy pointed toward a cluster of houses farther along the shoreline. "My grandpa says nobody lasted more than a month here." "Really?" Lucas nodded seriously. "He says the shack is cursed." Ethan raised an eyebrow. And do you believe him? Not really. The boy paused. But weird stuff happens. Like what? Lucas pointed toward the harbor. Sometimes lights. Boat lights? No. The boy lowered his voice. Under the dock. Ethan felt a small chill despite the warm afternoon. You've seen them? Lucas nodded. Twice. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the boy wandered off down the shoreline with his fishing rod bouncing against his shoulder. That night, Ethan found himself thinking about the conversation while flipping through more of his uncle's notebooks. Hours passed. Wind rattled softly outside. The lantern on the table cast shifting shadows across the walls. Near midnight, he opened a journal from 14 years earlier. Most entries were ordinary weather observations. Then one sentence stopped him cold. Tide exceptionally low tonight. Access possible for approximately 43 minutes. Ethan read it twice. Access possible? Access to what? He turned the page. The next entry had been torn out. Not damaged, removed deliberately. Several pages afterward contained the same symbol from the tunnel beneath the storage room. 3 vertical lines crossed by 1 horizontal mark. Ethan sat back in his chair. The locked locker, the hidden cavity beneath the floor, the symbol, the missing pages, the strange photograph, the lights Lucas claimed to see beneath the dock. Each clue by itself meant nothing. Together they felt like pieces of something larger slowly emerging from the shadows. Then another detail caught his attention. In the margin beside one symbol, his uncle had written 2 words. Last access. Ethan stared at the phrase for a long moment. Somewhere on the property was something his uncle had been reaching periodically for years. And judging by those notebooks, the tides mattered. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn and immediately checked the tide chart pinned beside the kitchen window. He wasn't even sure why he was doing it anymore. A week earlier, he barely understood how tides worked. Now he found himself comparing water levels to notes written by a man he had spent most of his life avoiding. According to the chart, an unusually low tide would arrive shortly after sunset. The same condition mentioned repeatedly throughout his uncle's journals. The same condition connected to the phrase, last access. Ethan spent the morning trying to ignore the growing curiosity. He repaired a section of dock railing. He sorted tools inside the storage room. He even drove into town to sell several piles of scrap metal he had collected around the property. The recycling yard paid less than he hoped, but more than he expected. $32. Not much, yet enough to buy groceries for another week. On the way back, he stopped at Grace's diner. The lunch crowd was thin. A pair of fishermen argued over baseball scores, while a woman in a postal uniform worked through a stack of paperwork near the window. Grace set down a cup of coffee before Ethan ordered. You look tired. Been sleeping through storms. That'll do it. She leaned against the counter. Still living in that shack? Still standing. Grace smiled. People are starting to place bets. Ethan laughed. On what? How long before you give up? That's encouraging. Actually, you're doing better than most predictions. As he stirred sugar into the coffee, another voice interrupted. Thomas would have liked that. Ethan turned and found Walter settling onto a stool beside him. The old fisherman carried a folded newspaper beneath one arm. Liked what? Ethan asked. Walter nodded toward Grace. The betting. He always enjoyed proving people wrong. Ethan studied him for a moment. You knew him pretty well, didn't you? Walter's smile faded slightly. Long time ago. Everybody keeps saying things like that. Like what? That they knew him, that people misunderstood him. that there's more to the story.
Walter looked toward the harbor outside the window.
Sometimes a town decides who a man is before it learns the truth. Ethan waited. For once it seemed Walter might actually explain something. Instead, the old fisherman reached into his jacket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the counter. Ethan unfolded the cloth carefully. Inside sat a tarnished brass compass, old but still intact. "That belonged to your uncle," Walter said. Ethan looked surprised. "Why do you have it?" "Because he loaned it to me 20 years ago and forgot to ask for it back." Walter's expression softened. "Figure it's yours now." Ethan turned the compass over in his hands. Initials were engraved on the back. T.W. Below them was another marking. The same symbol from the journals. 3 vertical lines crossed by 1 horizontal bar. His pulse quickened immediately. "Walter!" The old man stood before Ethan could finish. "Keep it." Then he walked out of the diner. Ethan stared after him. The conversation felt intentional, almost as if Walter wanted him to notice the symbol. By late afternoon, Ethan returned to the shack. The compass sat on the table beside several journals while he compared symbols and notes. He noticed something he had missed before. The symbol rarely appeared alone. Often, it was written beside references to tide levels, occasionally beside coordinates, once beside a sketch of the harbor itself. As sunset approached, Ethan grabbed a flashlight and headed for the storage room. The tide was already beginning to fall. He removed the loose board near locker 11 and lowered himself carefully into the cavity below. The air inside smelled damp and ancient. His flashlight revealed stone walls covered with salt stains. Wooden supports stretched toward the harbor beneath the property. The space was narrow enough that he had to crouch while moving forward. After several yards, he reached a dead end, or what appeared to be a dead end. The beam illuminated more of the strange symbols carved into the wood. Someone had marked this place repeatedly over many years. Ethan touched one carving with his fingers. The edges felt worn smooth. Then something caught his attention. A faint reflection near the floor. He knelt and brushed aside dirt. A glass bottle emerged from the shadows. The cork remained intact despite years underground. Inside was a tightly rolled piece of paper. Ethan carefully removed it. The paper crackled as he unrolled it. It wasn't a letter. It was a map. A hand-drawn map of the harbor. Certain locations were marked with circles. Several notes appeared along the margins. Most were faded beyond recognition. One remained readable. "Wait for the water to leave." Ethan frowned. The wording sounded strange. Not wait for low tide. Wait for the water to leave. As though something became accessible only when the harbor emptied completely. He followed the map with his eyes. One line extended beneath the dock itself. Another pointed toward a location beyond the storage room. And at the end of both lines, someone had drawn a small square. Ethan recognized it instantly. It looked exactly like a locker. A chill ran through him. The final locked locker upstairs was no longer an isolated mystery. Somehow it connected directly to whatever system of tunnels, maps, and hidden locations his uncle had spent decades documenting. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed through the cavity. Footsteps. Ethan froze. The sound came again, slow, careful. Above him, someone was walking through the storage room. Ethan killed the flashlight instantly and remained perfectly still beneath the storage room floor. The darkness swallowed everything. Above him, the footsteps continued. Slow, deliberate. Wooden boards creaked under shifting weight. Whoever was up there wasn't simply passing by. They were moving around the room. Ethan held his breath and listened. For nearly a minute, nothing happened except the occasional groan of old timber. Then came the metallic sound of a locker door opening, followed by another and another. Someone was checking the lockers. Ethan's heart began beating faster. He carefully slid backward into a deeper section of the cavity and waited. The footsteps eventually stopped near the far end of the room, where the final locked locker stood. Silence followed, long enough to become uncomfortable. Then a voice muttered something, too quiet to understand. A few seconds later came the sound of a hand rattling the padlock. Once, twice, 3 times. Whoever it was seemed frustrated. Ethan considered announcing himself, but decided against it. He didn't even know who he was dealing with. After another minute, the footsteps retreated toward the door. The storage building creaked. Then silence returned. Ethan waited 5 more minutes before climbing back out. By the time he reached the surface, the room was empty. He swept the flashlight across the lockers. Everything appeared normal until he noticed muddy footprints on the floor. Fresh footprints. He crouched beside them. Large boots. Not Walter's. Not Lucas's. The impressions led directly to the final locker and back toward the exit. Whoever had visited wasn't interested in old fishing gear. They had come for the locked locker. The realization stayed with Ethan all night. The next morning he woke earlier than usual and walked into town carrying the map he had found inside the bottle. He stopped at the public library, a small brick building overlooking the harbor. Inside, only one employee was working, a woman named Evelyn Hart, who looked old enough to remember half the town's history firsthand. She wore reading glasses attached to a chain around her neck and seemed genuinely pleased to have a visitor. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ethan unfolded the map carefully on a table. "Maybe." Evelyn adjusted her glasses. "Interesting. You recognize it?" "Not exactly." She leaned closer. "But that's an old harbor survey layout." Ethan sat down across from her. "How old?" "At least 40 years, possibly older." Evelyn disappeared into a back room and returned carrying several large binders filled with documents. For nearly an hour they compared maps. Most didn't match. Then Evelyn stopped suddenly. "Here." Ethan leaned forward. One faded survey showed a structure extending beneath the original dock system decades earlier. Several underground maintenance passages connected storage areas and fuel lines used by fishing vessels. Most had supposedly been sealed long ago. "What happened to them?" Ethan asked. Evelyn frowned. "Officially." "Officially?" "Storm damage." Ethan noticed the hesitation immediately. "And unofficially?" Evelyn removed her glasses. "People said other things." "Like what?" She studied him for a moment. "There was an accident." "What kind of accident?" "Fishing vessel." Ethan felt a chill. "When?" 32 years ago." Evelyn turned several pages until she located an old newspaper clipping. The headline immediately caught Ethan's attention. "Local rescue boat missing during storm." Below the article appeared a photograph of 4 men standing beside a harbor vessel. Ethan froze. One of them was his uncle. The same younger version he had seen in the photograph from the shack. Beside him stood 3 other men. One of them looked remarkably familiar. "Who's that?" Ethan asked. Evelyn followed his finger. "That's Harold Mercer." related to Diane Mercer? Her father. Ethan stared at the article. According to the report, the rescue vessel had disappeared during a violent storm while attempting to assist a disabled fishing boat. The official investigation never determined exactly what happened. Several men survived. Others didn't. The harbor spent years arguing about who was responsible. Ethan read every line twice. One sentence stood out.
Thomas Walker declined to comment following the incident.
People blamed my uncle, he asked quietly. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Some did. Why? Because he was the last man seen returning to the harbor. Ethan sat back. Suddenly, dozens of comments made more sense. The awkward pauses, the unfinished explanations, the strange way people talked about Thomas Walker. Not with dislike exactly. More like uncertainty, as if nobody knew whether he was a hero or a villain. Before leaving, Ethan copied several dates from the article. One date matched an entry in the journals marked with the symbol. Another matched a missing page torn from a notebook. By the time he returned to the shack, his mind was racing. He spent the afternoon comparing newspaper dates with his uncle's records. The connections were becoming impossible to ignore. Near sunset, Lucas appeared carrying a small bucket of bait. "You look busy," the boy said. Ethan showed him one of the old photographs. "Ever seen these men before?" Lucas pointed immediately. "That's Diane's dad." "You know him?" "He's dead." Lucas shrugged. "Everybody knows that." Ethan almost smiled. Children had a way of reducing complicated things into simple facts. Then Lucas pointed toward Thomas Walker. "My grandpa says that guy saved lives." Ethan blinked. "Your grandpa said that?" "Yep." "Then why does everyone act weird when I ask about him?" Lucas thought for a moment. "Maybe because old people like secrets." The answer was so simple, Ethan couldn't help laughing. After Lucas left, darkness settled over the harbor. Ethan sat alone on the dock, reading the rescue article again. Wind moved gently across the water. The tide was beginning to retreat. Somewhere beneath the dock, hidden tunnels waited in the darkness. Somewhere above them sat a locked locker that other people were apparently trying to access. And now another mystery had joined the list. 32 years earlier, something had happened during a storm. Something important enough that people were still avoiding the subject decades later. Then, just as Ethan folded the article and stood to return inside, he noticed a faint light moving beneath the dock. Not a reflection, not moonlight, an actual light. Brief, flickering, then gone. Ethan stood motionless on the dock long after the light disappeared. The water below looked calm again, disturbed only by gentle ripples moving between the pilings. He rubbed his eyes and looked a second time. Nothing. Just darkness beneath the old dock. Yet he knew what he had seen. The light had not come from a boat. It had originated beneath the structure itself. Somewhere below the harbor. For several minutes he debated climbing down immediately. But the tide was already turning. The water had begun creeping back toward the shoreline. Whatever existed under the dock would have to wait. Reluctantly, he returned to the shack. Sleep proved impossible. He spent hours studying the old map spread across the kitchen table. Every few minutes he compared it to his uncle's notebooks. The more he examined the documents, the more one detail stood out. Several of the marked dates corresponded with exceptionally low tides, not storms, not fishing seasons. Low tides. Whatever Thomas Walker had been doing required the water to retreat shortly after dawn. Ethan drove into town and found Walter sitting on the usual harbor bench with two other fishermen. A thermos rested beside him.
The old man looked up as Ethan approached.
"You look terrible."
"Didn't sleep much." Walter nodded.
"Good. Means you're paying attention."
Ethan sat beside him. "I saw a light under the dock." Walter's expression remained neutral.
"Did you?
"You're not surprised."
Should I be?"
Ethan stared at him. Walter stared back. One of the other fishermen quietly stood and wandered away, leaving them alone.
"What aren't you telling me?" Ethan asked.
Walter sighed heavily.
"Sometimes people spend years looking for answers they aren't ready to hear."
"That's not an answer."
"No."
Walter took a sip from his thermos.
"It's not."
Ethan almost laughed from frustration. Every conversation in Grayport seemed to follow the same pattern. A clue appeared. Someone hinted at something important. Then they stopped talking before Ethan could press further. Walter reached into his coat pocket and handed him a folded piece of paper.
"What's this?" "Harbor maintenance schedule from 30 years ago."
Ethan unfolded it. Most of the information seemed mundane. Inspection dates, repair records, equipment lists. Then he noticed one section highlighted in pencil. Tunnel access points. His pulse quickened. Walter stood before Ethan could ask another question.
"Low tide tonight," the old fisherman said. "Don't waste it."
Then he walked away. By late afternoon, Ethan was back at the shack preparing supplies. Flashlight, rope, gloves, water bottle. He felt ridiculous gathering equipment for what might amount to nothing more than an old drainage tunnel. Yet experience had taught him that every strange clue on the property eventually led somewhere. Shortly before sunset, Lucas appeared carrying a fishing rod. "You going somewhere?" the boy asked. Ethan hesitated. "Maybe." Lucas grinned. "Secret somewhere?" Ethan laughed. "You're spending too much time around fishermen. Grandpa says fishermen lie all the time." "Your grandpa sounds wise." Lucas pointed toward the water. "Tide's dropping fast." Ethan followed his gaze. The boy was right. Large sections of shoreline, usually submerged, were already visible. After Lucas left, Ethan waited another hour, then another. Finally, the water reached its lowest point. According to the tide chart, he had less than 50 minutes before it began rising again. Flashlight in hand, he climbed beneath the dock. The smell of wet wood and salt filled the air. Barnacles coated the lower supports. Water dripped steadily from beams overhead. Guided by the map, he moved carefully between exposed pilings until he reached a section normally hidden beneath several feet of water. There, partially concealed behind seaweed-covered rocks, he found it. A narrow opening in the stone foundation, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Ethan crouched and aimed the flashlight inside. A tunnel extended into darkness. His heart began pounding. The map had been accurate. The passage was real. He entered slowly. The floor remained damp but mostly dry thanks to the unusually low tide. Stone walls surrounded him. In several places, he spotted the familiar symbol carved into support beams. 3 vertical lines crossed by 1 horizontal mark. Thomas had definitely used this route. 10 yards inside, the tunnel widened. 15 yards farther, Ethan discovered something unexpected. Footprints. Recent footprints. The mud preserved them clearly. Someone else had been here, not decades ago, recently. The realization made him grip the flashlight tighter. He continued forward. Around a bend, the tunnel opened into a small chamber beneath the harbor. Wooden crates lined one wall, Most had collapsed long ago. Rusted metal brackets protruded from stonework overhead. Then his flashlight beam landed on something hanging from a nail. A key. Ethan approached cautiously. The key was old, but surprisingly well preserved. A brass tag remained attached. On the tag was a number. 12. Ethan froze. There were 12 lockers inside the storage building. The final locked locker was number 12. For several seconds, he simply stared. The key had been hidden beneath the harbor all this time? Then he noticed another object beside it, a small waterproof tin. He opened it carefully. Inside lay a folded note written in Thomas Walker's handwriting. The message contained only one sentence. If you're reading this, someone else has already started looking. Ethan read the line twice. A chill ran through him. Suddenly, the mysterious visitor from the storage room seemed far more important. He slipped both the note and the key into his pocket. Then he heard something, a sound echoing through the tunnel behind him. Not water, not wind. Footsteps. Someone else had just entered the passage. Ethan immediately switched off his flashlight. Darkness swallowed the tunnel once again. The footsteps continued somewhere beyond the bend he had just passed. Slow. Careful. Whoever was entering knew enough to move cautiously. Ethan's hand tightened around the brass key in his pocket. For several seconds, he considered hiding deeper inside the chamber. But the rising tide changed everything. Water would soon begin flooding the lower sections of the passage. Staying underground too long could trap him. He needed to leave. Quietly. The footsteps grew louder. Ethan backed toward the opposite side of the chamber and discovered a narrow gap between two collapsed crates. He squeezed into the space just as a flashlight beam swept across the tunnel entrance. A figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, wearing a waterproof jacket and rubber boots. The person moved directly toward the chamber without hesitation. That alone told Ethan something important. This wasn't a random trespasser. Whoever it was already knew the tunnel existed. The beam moved across the walls, pausing briefly on the nail where the key had been hanging. The figure froze, then stepped closer. Ethan watched from behind the crates as the stranger examined the empty hook. Even in the dim light, he could see frustration in the movement. The person had expected the key to be there. After several tense moments, the stranger muttered something under their breath and turned back toward the tunnel. Minutes later, the footsteps faded completely. Ethan remained hidden for another 5 minutes before emerging. His pulse still raced. Somebody else had been searching for exactly what he had found. The note from Thomas suddenly seemed less mysterious and much more like a warning. If you're reading this, someone else has already started looking. The old man had known. Somehow, he had known. Ethan hurried through the passage and reached open air just as the first waves of the incoming tide began washing over the rocks. By the time he climbed back onto the dock, seawater had already covered the tunnel entrance. Another 20 minutes, and it would have disappeared entirely. Inside the shack, he locked the door for the first time since moving in. Then he placed the brass key on the kitchen table beneath the lantern light. Number 12. The final locker. For nearly an hour, he stared at it while debating what to do. Common sense said wait until morning. Curiosity won. He grabbed the flashlight and crossed the property toward the storage building. The night felt unusually quiet. Even the gulls seemed absent. The row of lockers stood exactly where he had left them. Rusted metal, peeling paint, years of neglect. Ethan approached locker 12 and held the key in front of the padlock. His hands were actually shaking. The key slid in smoothly. He turned it. A metallic click echoed through the room. The lock opened. Ethan removed it carefully and pulled on the locker door. For a moment, it refused to move. Then the hinges groaned and the door slowly swung open. He expected cash, documents, maybe valuables. Instead, he found a weatherproof metal box sitting alone on the bottom shelf. Nothing else. Just the box. He lifted it onto a nearby workbench. The lid was secured with simple latches rather than another lock. Ethan opened them slowly. Inside were several bundles wrapped in oilcloth. The first bundle contained photographs, dozens of them. Harbor scenes, fishing boats, rescue crews, newspaper clippings. The second bundle held notebooks far older than the ones inside the shack. The third contained a collection of letters. Then he found something that immediately captured his attention. A thick envelope labeled, "Open Last." Beneath the envelope lay a folded chart marked with coordinates extending several miles offshore. Ethan carefully set the chart aside and reached for one of the photographs. His breath caught. The image showed Thomas Walker standing beside the rescue vessel mentioned in the newspaper article. On the back, someone had written a date. It matched the night the vessel disappeared. Another photograph showed the same crew only hours earlier, smiling, laughing, completely unaware of what was coming. Ethan spent nearly an hour sorting through the contents. Piece by piece, a larger picture began forming. The rescue vessel disaster had never been fully explained because key evidence had vanished shortly after the investigation. Witness statements, maintenance records, personal journals, documents that should have existed but somehow disappeared. Yet copies of many of them were now sitting inside the metal box. Thomas had preserved everything. Suddenly, headlights swept across the windows of the storage building. Ethan froze. A vehicle had stopped outside the property. He quickly extinguished the lantern and moved toward the doorway. Through a crack in the wall, he spotted a pickup truck parked near the road. The driver remained inside with the engine running, watching, waiting. After several minutes, the truck finally pulled away into the darkness. Ethan waited until the taillights vanished completely. Then he returned to the workbench. His attention shifted to the envelope marked "Open Last." The handwriting belonged to Thomas, older, less steady than the writing in the journals. Ethan carefully opened the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The first sentence immediately made him sit down. Ethan, if you've reached this point, then you found the evidence they spent 30 years trying to bury. Ethan read the first line 3 times before continuing. The lantern light flickered softly across the page while waves rolled against the pilings outside. Every sound in the harbor seemed distant now. The letter held his complete attention. Thomas's handwriting was uneven but still readable. The old fisherman explained that the rescue vessel had never disappeared because of recklessness, as many townspeople believed. The truth was far more complicated. During the storm 32 years earlier, another commercial fishing boat had suffered catastrophic engine failure near a reef several miles offshore. The rescue vessel answered the distress call. What followed was chaos. Towering waves, failing equipment, radio communications that stopped midway through the operation. Several crew members survived only because Thomas ignored direct orders and took actions that later embarrassed powerful people in the harbor authority and local fishing industry. Ethan continued reading. According to the letter, evidence proving what happened had gradually vanished after the official investigation. Witnesses changed statements. Reports disappeared. Records were altered. Thomas spent decades quietly collecting copies of everything, not because he wanted revenge, but because he believed the truth deserved to survive. The final paragraph stopped Ethan cold. There is one last place you need to visit. Use the coordinates. Then you'll understand why I stayed. Ethan immediately unfolded the chart from the metal box. The coordinates pointed several miles offshore beyond a cluster of rocky shoals. The location wasn't marked with a name, just a circle and the familiar symbol that appeared throughout the journals. The next morning, Ethan drove into town before sunrise. He found Walter preparing a small fishing boat at the marina. The old man barely looked surprised when Ethan approached carrying the chart.
Thought you might show up. Ethan held up the paper. You knew about this?
Walter secured a rope and nodded. Some of it. Then come with me. Walter studied the chart for several seconds. Then he sighed. Guess it's time. An hour later, they were crossing open water beneath clear skies. Grayport shrank behind them. The sea remained calm, though Walter still checked conditions constantly, just as fishermen always did. During the trip, Ethan asked dozens of questions. For once, Walter answered. The old man explained how Thomas had become an easy target after the rescue incident. People wanted someone to blame. Thomas refused to defend himself publicly because doing so would have exposed families whose livelihoods depended on the harbor. He carried it all these years? Ethan asked. Walter nodded. Some men care more about protecting people than protecting themselves. Eventually, the boat reached the coordinates. At first, Ethan saw nothing unusual. Then Walter pointed toward the water. There. Just beneath the surface lay a network of submerged wooden structures, old pilings, remnants of a forgotten fishing station. Time and storms had nearly erased it. Almost. They anchored nearby and spent hours exploring. Among the remains, they discovered several weatherproof containers secured beneath a collapsed platform. Inside were more journals, maintenance records, and maps documenting fishing grounds throughout the region. Ethan finally understood. Thomas had not been protecting treasure. He had been preserving knowledge, decades of observations, migration patterns, seasonal changes, safe channels through dangerous waters, information gathered over an entire lifetime. Knowledge that had allowed him to survive and fish successfully long after others gave up. On the return trip, Walter smiled for the first time in days. Now you know why he stayed. Ethan nodded. He did. The shack had never been about money. The locker had never been about gold. Everything pointed towards something much larger. Legacy. Over the following months, life slowly changed. Ethan restored more of the property. He repaired the dock section by section. Using the journals, he began fishing local waters with surprising success. The records Thomas left behind proved more valuable than any inheritance he could have imagined. The harbor community gradually changed, too. Diane Mercer helped organize a public exhibit displaying the documents recovered from the locker. Evelyn contributed newspaper archives. Walter shared stories he had kept to himself for decades. Even people who once criticized Thomas started seeing him differently. One afternoon, nearly a year after arriving in Grayport, Ethan stood beside the restored dock, watching Lucas cast a fishing line into the harbor. The boy missed the water entirely and hooked a piling instead. "You weren't even close," Ethan laughed. Lucas grinned. Fish knew I was coming. Some things never changed. Nearby, tourists occasionally stopped to photograph the old shack. Few realized how close it had come to disappearing forever. Fewer still knew what had been hidden beneath it. As the sun began setting over the harbor, Ethan walked into the storage building one final time. Locker 12 remained open now, empty except for a single object resting on the bottom shelf: the brass key. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand. Such a small thing, yet it had opened far more than a locker. It had opened a forgotten story, a buried truth, a second chance. Outside, waves tapped gently against the dock Thomas Walker had built with his own hands decades earlier. Ethan stepped into the evening light and locked the storage room behind him. For the first time in many years, he wasn't wondering where he would go next. He was already home.